Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 13th episode of Stories of Service, where we feature ordinary people who do extraordinary work. And I am the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today, as we always do, I have another amazing guest and a dear friend of mine. Her name is Inga Gibson, and I'm going to give you guys a little bit of information about Inga. She was my mentor in all things animal advocacy and really taught me a lot about consensus and working with different types of people from all across the aisle when it comes to their political beliefs, and really taught me how to be, a change agent. She is the president and policy director of Pono Advocacy, and she mentored me, like I said, all aspects of animal protection policy changes. She's an expert in human, animal, and environmental conflict resolution. She's coordinated numerous campaigns and projects, including directing political and grassroots organizing and community coalition building efforts. Her work has led to the passage of more than 30 state legislative measures, numerous regulatory changes, and significant corporate reforms that have advanced animal protection in human wildlife coexistence in Hawaii, the Pacific, and Northwest U.S. As the policy director of Pono Advocacy, she provides policy legislative consulting for nonprofit and governmental organizations, facilitates multi-stakeholder discussions on complex and often controversial issues, advises organizations and agencies on strategic media, public education, and communication initiatives. Now, prior to this, she was a senior state director for the Humane Society of the United States and the Pacific Islands policy coordinator for Humane Society International, where she coordinated extensively with county, state, and federal government agencies and policy makers. Some of her notable legislative achievements include the enactment of the nation's strongest anti-shark finning and wildlife trafficking laws. Prior to directing policy initiatives in Hawaii and the Pacific, she was a project manager and oversaw legislative efforts in Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and Idaho. Welcome to the show, Inga.
Oh, thank you, Teresa. Sorry, but thank you for that long introduction. I really appreciate it. It's so great to be here and to see you again. I miss you.
I miss you too, and absolutely. I like I said, I admire your work so much. So I'm going to start off just asking you sort of your background and how you got started in the world of animal advocacy. And then we're going to end it on sort of what people can do to be a change agent in their community, whether it's in animals or their school board or wherever, how they can enact positive change. So what inspired you to go down this road and do this as your lifelong career?
Well, I think, like a lot of advocates today, it was, a lot based on my own personal childhood experiences and, living in places where I saw firsthand some of the poor treatment, the ill treatment of animals. I grew up primarily in Hawaii, but also spent some time in the Pacific, in American Samoa, and also in Guam. And unfortunately, these are areas where they have large street dog populations, where they don't have access to regular veterinary care, let alone any kind of policy initiatives protecting animals. So I think as a child, I was always drawn to animals, their vulnerability, our need to speak for them, and then, kind of carried that through to when I was in my undergraduate program, and even prior to that here in Hawaii, starting as a volunteer at the local Hawaiian Humane Society, and really seeing firsthand some of the issues in animal sheltering, with some of the challenges. Most of these issues are animal. I always, my mantra is kind of animal issues are people issues. And working in shelters and eventually being on the front lines as a humane investigator, I saw a lot of the challenges and realized that really, the way to best help animals is to be able to work with people. I know it's funny. A lot of people say, I get along better with animals than with people. And I can appreciate that. And I know that, to a lot of folks, they like just, the front lines of animal care. And we absolutely need, those frontliners that are out there rescuing and sheltering and caring for the animals. But really, I believe that the biggest way to make a change for the broader the broader good of animals is to be able to work with people, because obviously that is the link, influencing people to take responsibility and understand their kuleana, as we say here in Hawaii, their responsibility to care for all of those less fortunate, and the same whether it's animals or children or the elderly or the houseless. It's something that you can really carry to any other vulnerable population.
Absolutely. It is one of those types of communities within the animal community where some of the people, you're right, who do get involved in it say they hate people, and that's why they get involved with animals. But you can't be an effective advocate to change the conditions for animals unless you understand how to work with people. And so after you went through school, what was your first job within this arena?
Well, I started volunteering at the local Hawaiian Humane Society and kind of worked my way through various positions. And then when time allowed with my studies, I was actually able to get a full-time position with the local Humane Society. So that was my first kind of formal working within an animal protection agency, and it was a great, an amazing experience. And it's interesting because that's really what prompted me to take my passion and my career even further. When I spent my last couple of years there with the Humane Society as an animal control officer, a humane investigator, I was really frustrated because of the lack of laws. At that time, back in the early, 20 something years ago, we didn't have the laws that we now have today. I mean, we didn't have a felony for animal cruelty. We didn't even have requirements for veterinary care. We didn't have really much of anything. And this was, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the rest of the nation, was addressing animal welfare laws. But Hawaii was really still way behind the curve, way behind the national trend for increasing protections for animals. So it was kind of my frustration, I guess, as being an officer and going out and responding to these calls and not being able to do more, that I pivoted more or less to going into policy work. So I worked the front lines. I am obviously very interested and a strong advocate voice for animal shelters, especially open admission shelters, which, all of our shelters here in Hawaii are, taking all animals regardless of age, size, breed, condition. But I took that experience and then went on to graduate school and focused on public policy, because I really felt at that point that if I wanted to make the bigger difference for animals, not just in Hawaii, but globally, that I need to start focusing on the policy side of things. How can I, influence these laws so that I can really best help my colleagues that are still on the front lines. And so I went on to graduate school and got a master's in public policy and administration, and then went back a few years ago to get a graduate degree in conflict resolution, because like we said earlier, it really is about dealing with people, and being, to help animals, you really have to understand people and be able to work with all types of people from all types of backgrounds, politically, culturally, socially. So, yeah.
Can you let us know what are some of the initiatives within animal protection policy that you think you're most proud of, and you thought, just this is never going to happen, we're never going to get this bill passed, and you were able to see it through? Can you tell us a little bit about a couple of those?
Sure. There's been many. I think one of them was sorry, I've got a siren here. I'm near the city.
Okay.
One of it is, Hawaii was one of the last 2 states to enact a felony for dog fighting. And this was back in 2010. We began the effort. It was just Hawaii and Montana, the only 2 states in the nation that did not have a felony level penalty for the egregious, most heinous, exploitive act of dogfighting. So it was interesting because a lot of my direct advocacy lobbying legislative outreach was really just trying to educate lawmakers about, what is dogfighting and is it actually prevalent here in Hawaii, and, what are the potential unintended consequences of passing a law. And, some of the questions I got were, what if my dog attacks my neighbor's dog? Am I going to get charged with dog fighting? And, well, I don't read about this in the paper, so I don't think this really happens. And then, of course, Teresa, being very familiar with Hawaii, cockfighting, although it's illegal here, it's only a misdemeanor. There was a lot of concern about the slippery slope. Well, if they ban dog fighting, next up, they're going to really try to crack down on cockfighting. So it was really challenging. It was frustrating because as part of my efforts to inform the legislator, I personally, I had already been very familiar with dogfighting, having worked with Humane Society United States, but, I went through hours and hours of the most gruesome video, read a lot of material about dogfighting, did a lot of research, investigative work to determine basically that Hawaii does indeed have dogfighting, just like, most communities. It's not something you're going to read about. It's not something that is, for the most part conducted out in the public, but it happens. And it happens across all different socioeconomic classes, as we learned with Michael Vick and others. It's not in certain, communities, as some may think. So it was a challenge getting some, legislators in key influential leadership positions to finally get on board. And it took about, I think it was 3 years until we finally enacted that law. And by the time we got there, I was able to get our prosecuting attorney on board. I was able to get the police department on board. All of the humane societies, of course, that enforce the animal care and control laws were on board. But it was, it was really frustrating initially because you're sharing these images of just the most violent, exploitive activity, and people just didn't want to really face that might be happening in their community. But fortunately, and to this day, we actually have one of the strongest anti-dogfighting laws in the country. We were able to get a felony not only for the act of dogfighting itself and possession with intent, but also for being a spectator and for possessing paraphernalia that would be used in dogfighting. So it ended up being worth it. And I remind myself, as I remind other advocates, that a good bill usually takes, anywhere from even 2 to 5 years to pass. So it's a hard thing to accept when you're like me, where you want action yesterday, you want things to happen. But that is kind of the reality of the legislative process, and you'll see the same in Congress. Sometimes decades.
It's the reality at any organization when you want to make change. In a big organization where there's so many different stakeholders, and a lot of times what we find in advocacy and policy is that it's one thing for people to want the change, but it's another thing to have the bill funded. It's another thing to know that the law enforcement has the resources to enforce the policies. And so you're coming up against a lot of sometimes resistance that's not, oh, we don't want to do this because we're cool to animals, but it's because we just simply maybe have other priorities on our plate, and this can't be the priority this session. I'm sure you run into that quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these are there's similar things that all advocates that especially work in any kind of policy work run up against, competing priorities, especially if you're asking for limited resources, if you're asking for, state agencies that are already strapped and understaffed and underfunded to take on additional responsibilities. So, you have to be very pragmatic yet persistent, I think, and creative. I mean, there's been a number of times that we've had to really kind of change course on our proposals, to get the key stakeholders, to get the key agencies on board, and so it's really important to be flexible.
Can you give me an example of some of those creative strategies, like something that you've seen that worked, that you were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that worked, but doing this event or pulling this off this way actually helped turn the tide on this issue?
Yeah, well, I think, maybe our shark protection act that actually just finally passed this year. This was it turned out to be an amazing year for Hawaii's animals. And despite, the pandemic and the legislature, the Capitol being closed now for going on 2 years to, meaning closed physically to the public. So the Shark Protection Act, I had been working on for probably about 7 years. This is an example of really being persistent. And it was prompted by a case back, I think, in 2013, where someone had, intentionally captured a tiger shark and pulled her up onto the rocks with a cable and chain, severely injuring her, breaking her jaw, damaging her fins, and it was videotaped. These were young kids that were proud of their ability to basically just abuse and torture this shark. So of course it was videotaped. It made national news, then it made international news, and of course, working with state wildlife and other agencies, law enforcement, we all said, okay, what's going to be done? And that's when we realized that there was no penalty for the intentional killing of sharks. And there had been other cases, but this was probably the most egregious. And again, because it did make international headlines, and it really, impacted, disrespected the Native Hawaiian community, because sharks here are mono, as they are known in Native Hawaiian, are sacred amakua. They're protectors, they're guardians. So it also really offended the cultural component of this issue, not outside of the actual cruelty, to the shark. And her name, they referred to her as Laverne because she was a known tiger shark to frequent Honokahau Harbor over on the Big Island. So this is kind of how legislation comes up. There's an issue that comes to your attention, and you look, are there laws? Is there any way to hold this individual accountable, or at least to provide a deterrent for others who may consider the same? So we began working with the state Department of Land and Natural Resources, and they pledged that they were going to try to address this issue with administrative rules. And so we kind of, sat back and said, okay, we're going to wait for the state to take the administrative rule process rather than state legislation. And meanwhile, because of that initial incident, me and some of my colleagues had started cataloging these reports. And we found that although we had, passed the strongest anti-shark finning law back in 2010, which set Hawaii up as a global leader in shark protection, because we didn't have that law or any other law that explicitly prohibited the killing of a whole shark, only possession of the fins or thinning the shark. That's when we realized we really needed to continue the legislation. So it was frustrating the first few years, and then getting folks on board within the fishing community, because the reality with fishing is that, you may accidentally capture a shark. When you're out fishing for other species, we have more than 40 species of shark mono that frequent our waters here. So it was a lot of outreach to the fishing community to let them know that this is about intentional capture and killing. This is not about, ethical fishers who accidentally hook a shark and then release the shark, because that's what we want them to do. But we needed something to get at the cases that we were seeing of sharks being caught and their teeth and their jaws being removed, or other, parts outside of our landmark fin law. So this session, after many years of the bill literally passing every year and kind of dying in the 11th hour due to various behind the scenes opposition, most of the time from commercial interests. Or even shark researchers that were worried that the bill might inhibit their ability to continue research, which it absolutely wouldn't. But this year we continued to work with Office of Hawaiian Affairs, the Native Hawaiian community, a lot of Kanaka, locals that were able to really speak to the disrespect and the need for the laws to protect these animals. We worked with the state. And we basically got everyone on board, including the legislators. And that's what allowed it to finally pass this year. We made an extended effective date, and to allow for community outreach and education efforts. And actually, that's one of the things I'm working on now. The bill was signed by Governor Ige on June 8th, World Oceans Day. How apropos! But doesn't actually take effect until January 1st of 2022. So we're in the process of reaching out to the communities to inform them of this new law that's coming. And it's I think a success story, especially in how long so many of us advocated. And now Hawaii is essentially not only with the strongest shark fin law still standing on the books, but also now the only state in the nation that explicitly prohibits the intentional killing or capture of sharks. Less, of course, a few minor exemptions that would be necessary. So, yeah. So that was it, and we had to get creative because there was a lot of opposition. We had to, make the amendments, to address some of the concerns of the community.
And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand too, is that there's so many different groups that have to come together in order for a bill to be passed. And there's a place for all kinds of organizations to be a part of this effort. There's a lot of people that say, oh, they want to just support their local humane society. But I know you had a lot of experience, a lot of years with the Humane Society of the United States. And I'd like you to address sort of what the difference is between a lot of people are like, well, I go and I volunteer at my local shelter. But what is it that you think that the major and the national organizations within animal protection bring to the fight that sometimes can't be done at the local level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for the opportunity. Well, first of all, unfortunately, there's plenty of work to go around. So there's no shortage of advocacy needed at the neighborhood level, the local level, state, federal, and so forth. And I think that's really where a lot of the national organizations play a role, because they have that physical presence in DC, and they're able to work on federal legislation that is absolutely critical. Typically, national organizations have more resources, meaning they're able to bring on more staff expertise, scientists, and others that smaller organizations would not have access to. And then, of course, a lot of them, given that they are larger and, with some of that access to more resources, they can provide more support to the smaller organizations, especially when they're dealing with large scale human or natural made, disasters. That's I think some of my best experiences with the Humane Society of the United States involve being able to deploy to communities across the world. I went to the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. We assisted the community there after those horrific typhoons, and obviously going down 3 deployments to Hurricane Katrina. After that, going to Tuscaloosa for the tornadoes, and also when I was in Washington overseeing a lot of these puppy mill horrible breeding situations. So I definitely, those in your local communities that are taking in the animals do such amazing work, and they need all the support they can get. I foster. My fosters are sleeping. Otherwise I'd bring them up. I foster and I support my local shelter. I work hand in hand at the state legislature and in the community with my local animal shelters. So they're great advocates, especially when you're looking at more local or community or state specific issues. I think that research has shown that the majority of people that donate to national organizations also donate locally and vice versa. So I think that the most important thing is that national organizations are sensitive to local dynamics, because in Hawaii we're so very unique, and thank goodness, Teresa, politically, socially, culturally, and I don't mean culturally ethnically, I mean just the history of Hawaii and being the threatened and endangered species capital of the world, and our marine issues, and just so many things that make it so unique. I think it's really important that folks realize that what may fly in California or New York City isn't necessarily going to fly in in Little Rock, Arkansas, or Honolulu, Hawaii, or wherever it may be. So I think that's where the local expertise and the local involvement is so important. And the relationships, everything about lobbying or advocacy really, it really comes down to relationships with policymakers.
Absolutely. Those relationships are so vital, because you can't get anything done unless you've worked to establish that rapport with either the legislators or the other groups. And if somebody's having a problem, let's say, because you've gone through this conflict resolution program, and I'm curious, if somebody's having a problem working with somebody on the other side of an issue, what are some of the ways that the strategies that you've used to gain consensus?
Well, my approach professionally has always kind of been my approach personally, and I'm a pretty upfront person. What you see is what you get. I've never been conflict averse. I have never seen conflict as something that's negative. I see it as necessary, and but to a lot of people, and here in Hawaii especially, culturally, conflict is something that people avoid at all costs, and that's why sometimes people say, we here in Hawaii are very passive aggressive, and you see that a lot actually in working in legislatures across, not just in Hawaii. You develop relationships and you hope that legislators, policymakers are upfront and honest, but you know that there are things that are happening behind the scenes. You know that there are economic issues, that that there are other priority issues. So I think you have to be sensitive to that. But my approach is, what I do in preparing for any legislative or any kind of policy initiative is reaching out to those who would be most impacted, and that includes those who may oppose. I think you remember this, Teresa, well, as the last thing I want to do as a legislative advocate is be blindsided in a committee hearing. I want to know what the concerns are and try to address those as early as possible. I would much rather go into a committee hearing with a list of proposed amendments or exemptions to address the concerns of opposition, assuming they're reasonable and they're not going to completely thwart the effort. But I would much rather know the opposition and try to work things out with them in advance of that, because educating legislators and coming to compromise isn't really something that happens, in a 2-minute testimony before a committee. It's really about the outreach and the relationship building and the trust. I think a lot of our achievements in animal protection is because, people trust you based on upholding commitments and promises when it relates to the issues, that you're putting forward, that that you have that integrity. I think that's really important.
And you can stand behind what you say, and you're consistent, and you're committed to trying to make things better. I know that when I started to explore my beliefs around animal pet breeding, there was a lot of opposition within the dog breeding community among people that love dogs, absolutely are amazing caretakers, and they breed ethically, but they are so afraid of any regulation about breeding. And we still, I think there's still some of that, obviously, today, even though I think it's gotten better over time. And I think a lot of it is slippery slope. They're just so afraid that any type of legislation that's going to regulate how they do breeding is going to somehow negatively impact them. But what they don't understand is that if there's no regulations, then all the bad actors and the people that are trying to destroy good breeders and trying to destroy the breeds are going to be the ones who prevail. So I think it's important for both sides of this issue to sit down, like you said, before a legislative session or before the hearing and understand what the concerns are and see if you can help to mitigate it, so that people understand that it's not about targeting the people that are doing things right with animals, but it's about eliminating the people that are abusing the animals.
Absolutely. And that's something I encounter a lot on just about any issue. There's always that slippery slope, or the straw man or the red herring or whatever logical kind of fallacy out there. That's human nature. That folks are going to be concerned, but and especially when we're talking about folks that are breeding animals for profit, or aquarium collectors who are selling the fish that they're taking from our reef, or the cockfighters or whatever. I mean, we're talking about people that are economically dependent upon the exploitation of animals. They literally make their dollars off the backs of animals. So they're coming from a different perspective, and it's challenging because you have to be sensitive to that, and you have to alleviate their concerns. But there are certain issues, like with cockfighting, for example, where it's really hard to find that compromise.
Right.
But with the puppy mill breeder situation here, as you well know, it was many years that we advocated for just the most basic regulation. Hawaii still has no regulation over no kind of licensing, permitting, regulation for pet stores, for breeders. So we've had to become creative in some of our approaches. We do have made some significant changes to our animal cruelty law, and our animal cruelty laws obviously apply to an individual, to a business, to a corporation. Also working with Senator Clayton He, as you know well, who is a huge animal champion.
Yes.
When we weren't able to really increase the penalties for those who are exploiting large numbers of animals, like we would see in some of these puppy mills, instead of focusing on the puppy mill licensing, so to speak, or breeder licensing, he was able to lead an effort. If there's any animal cruelty offense that's a misdemeanor that involves 10 or more animals, automatically becomes a felony. So there were ways to address some of the large scale backyard breeding situations without having to head on, go the approach that a lot of other communities have, which is through random inspections and licensing and so forth. So it's not perfect, but I think it's an example of ways that we have really significantly improved conditions and the quality of life for animals, dogs across Hawaii, without having to go head on into some of those who are so fearful of that slippery slope about impacting their bottom line.
And I think that's a big thing that you taught me, Inga, is that sometimes if there isn't a direct way to get something done, there might be an indirect approach to accomplish the same thing. And then, like you said, it's that incremental and approach, and having that strategic patience to slowly work at the issue, even behind the scenes. And while it may not seem like you're doing a whole lot, just you kind of banging that drum and then banging it over and over and over again after many, many years. And like you said, being very persistent, but in a respectful way. And like you said, also understanding the concerns on the other side, I think really helps to make people helps to deepen that trust, like you said, and people understand that you're in it for the right reasons and that your heart's in the right place. If somebody wants to get started as an advocate, like an advocate in their community group and their school board, or for veterans organizations, or human trafficking, or homelessness, or any population that's in need, what is a way that you would recommend that they get started?
Volunteer. That's what I still, to this day, when I talk to friends or folks that have saying, I still haven't really found my passion, or there's so many things I like to do, I don't know what to do, or I have limited time, where should I put my time? For me, volunteering, at my local shelter was really what inspired me to, dedicate my life, to animal protection. And I think it goes the same, whatever your interests are, whether it's working with homeless or, disabled populations, or, children, or, medical concerns and so forth, is to start by volunteering. From the animal protection side of things, they're, always looking for more volunteers, whether it's at your shelter or, a local rescue group. I think that's a great way to really see firsthand if that's something, that's really a good fit. Working in shelters, volunteering in shelters is hard. It's rewarding, it's invigorating, it's exciting, but it can be challenging because you're seeing, some of the day-to-day animals that are in need. But I think, like with any helping profession or social justice profession or field, volunteering I think is a great way to get involved. When it comes to making changes, I think from the policy side, I really want to emphasize to people the importance of their voice. I know it's frustrating that initiatives can take years, and people want to see changes more quickly. It's frustrating when you see policymakers defending a status quo when things need to change. But I think it's cliche, but every voice really does matter. Starting with getting to know your local representatives, whether it's at the city council, state legislature, your federal representatives. I mean, they're here to represent our interests as their constituents, and they may not share your same position on something. They may not have a good history or track record, but that doesn't mean that you stop letting them know how you feel. I just spoke with one of my congressional representatives via Zoom the other week, and we were pretty far apart on this particular issue, but I'm not going to stop reaching out to him and giving him information and encouraging others to do the same, because he is my representative,
Right.
And so that is my responsibility, I feel, to reach out to him and vice versa. So encourage people to get involved, volunteering, and also getting to know, building that relationship with your local elected officials. Really important.
All right. I think we're getting ready to wrap up here, but before I do so, was there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything else that you'd like to add?
Oh gosh. Well, we had a great year for animals. I just wanted to mention we actually passed 7 bills this session, which, as you know, is pretty significant.
It is.
Just kind of focusing back in on not giving up, I think is a good way maybe to close. Is some of these issues I had worked on with the local humane society for years. Not only the shark protection bill I mentioned, but just getting the most basic protections for dogs that are chained 24/7. We were able to prohibit the chaining of puppies. We were able to get a cruelty-free cosmetics bill passed. We were able to get veterinary reporting passed, and also provide protections to veterinarians from liability when they're offering emergency care to animals. So it was frustrating, obviously, last year with the pandemic for a lot of reasons. It was challenging, especially because the Capitol was closed. And everything was done remotely. But we ended, there was that political will, which is what we always need to push on. The advocates and the stakeholders stayed together. And the result was that after a number of years of a lot of frustration, we passed significant reforms here in Hawaii. And there's a lot more work to do, but it's nice to be able to take a little deep breath every now and then.
Well, congratulations, Inga. I'm really happy for you. I'm so glad we are friends. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, where can they find you?
They can, my website, ponoadvocacy.com, which I need to update. Maybe you can help me with that, Teresa. Teresa's always been my tech expert friend. Or just email me at ponoadvocacy@gmail.com. Yes.
Awesome. All right, Inga, just hold on for a second after we get off the call. I'll chat with you real quick backstage. But okay. I want to thank everybody for taking a moment and watching Stories of Service tonight. Hope you enjoyed the show. Next week, I cannot wait. We have a guest who is confirmed, and her name is Jennifer Klein. She's also known as the Miss DeWalt. She is a do-it-yourself expert. Started off making beautiful flags made out of wood, and her husband, he passed away, and she made a promise to continue to renovate their home afterwards. So she is just killing it and crushing it on TikTok. I can't believe she agreed to talk with us, but I'm super excited about it and can't wait to bring her on the show. But thank you all for watching tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening and have a great night. Talk to y'all later. Bye.